Yesterday when I introduced John Baldwin, I mentioned that John helps in a number of parishes in our archdiocese. And introducing today's speaker gives me yet another opportunity to say a word of thanks to the many Jesuit priests who help in a lot of parishes. And I say that as a pastor who appreciates every opportunity to tap the resources that they have. In the early 1980s, when I was a much younger priest than I am now, and I was beginning campus ministry at St. Paul's in Harvard Square, we were helped a great deal by the Jesuit priests and also by some seminarians. One of them was a very articulate young person whom I used to enjoy hearing his preaching, and he is our speaker this morning. Jim Keenan received a Master's of Divinity from Weston School of Theology, and then went on to Rome to get his license and doctorate in the area of moral theology. He taught at Fordham University and then came back to Cambridge to teach at Weston, and now has crossed the Charles River to be here in Boston College. His book, The Works of Mercy, The Heart of Catholicism, is his latest. Many of us know Jim through his articles in magazines like America, and especially his regular column in Church Magazine. So it's a delight personally to welcome Jim Keenan.
Thank you, John. As a matter of fact, it was in a parish that I work in here, St. Peter's in Cambridge, that I got really involved in this, and I don't see her here right now. Betty Ann Donnelly came up to me after the Gagin case broke and asked me, was I going to say anything about it or preach on it at all? And I said, why? And by the end of the week, I realized that as a priest in Boston, there was somehow that the gospel and the place that we live in had to come together, at least in what I wanted to preach. I'd like to also say I'm here because Ken Himes nominated me. I know that Tom really went out of his way to acknowledge Michael Himes, but Ken actually was involved in the programming, and he did nominate me to be up here. So if there's anyone to blame, you can blame Ken. The paper that I have online, I've pared down by about 10 minutes, so that I'm really interested in your comments and questions. About 2 years ago, I began asking the question of the moral rights of priests. Since I am not a canonist, I am not speaking about canonical rights. Rather, I use the word rights as a moral theologian, and as moral theologians and Christian social ethicists do when speaking of the right to food or work or health care, that is, a moral right. I propose these rights with the hope that they may eventually be articulated into canonical precepts, but I do not claim that they have canonical force today. Why do I ask about moral rights? Lately, we have seen priests writing and signing a variety of statements. For instance, on December 9, 2002, 58 Boston priests signed a letter calling for the resignation of Cardinal Bernard Law. In a letter of October 1, 2003, priests of Rockville Center called for a meeting with Bishop William Murphy over widespread dissatisfaction with his leadership. The priest of Chicago wrote an open letter to the hierarchy about the tone and content of church leaders' remarks about gay and lesbian persons, a letter subsequently adopted by priests from Rochester, New York, and Boston. Then there was the letter of last August signed by 160 priests in Milwaukee calling for a married clergy. More recently, 84 priests from Milwaukee wrote to Archbishop Dolan protesting his clergy support initiative, which would compel priests to relinquish basic American privacy rights and allow for unannounced searches of their property based on reports of suspicious activity. These actions are amazing inasmuch as many cannot remember during the 1980s or 1990s any other letters written by priests. Yet as an ethicist, I believe I have a responsibility to ask, do priests have a right to do this? Elsewhere, I have examined related questions such as how interested are priests in the rights of priests, and how appropriate is rights language for speaking about the priesthood. There I also began discussing 4 of the 6 rights that I am developing. But here, as I begin, I want to propose an important corollary between rights language and personhood. I do not see rights as voluntaristic assertions of power over and against others. I do not see rights as voluntaristic assertions of power over and against others. Rather, I see rights language as springing from a community of faith, looking to see how best its members can protect the good of the whole church and its specific members. Following Brian Tierney, I believe that rights were originally recognized by 11th and 12th century theologians and canonists who tried to articulate those rights that belong to popes, bishops, clergy, and other church members, not as inimical to the life of the church, but as constitutive of the church. In other words, way before the use of rights language appeared in modern liberal democracies, they were first expressed as intrinsic to the good of the church. Rights language developed in the 12th century precisely as we became more interested in the nature of the person. Carolyn Bynum points to the privileging of spiritual experiences of members of charismatic movements of the 12th century that eventually led in the next century to the founding of the great religious orders by Dominic, Francis, and Clare. In the 12th century, mystics saw themselves in union with God and understood God as triune, that is, as 3 persons in one God. Bynum asked the very relevant question, did the 12th century discover the individual? Her question is pivotal, inasmuch as much of the 12th century spirituality was an appreciation of God's love for the human in God's image. And inasmuch as that image was not predominantly Christological, but Trinitarian, the Christian saw her or himself more and more like the Trinity, that is, as a person constitutively related to other persons. Rights are for persons. The more we recognize someone's rights, the more we recognize their personhood. And the more we recognize their personhood, the more we recognize them as related to ourselves. Rights language, therefore, should not alienate or individuate, divide or polarize. Rather, rights language incorporates into the community, the human community, those who are persons. Upholding one's rights, then, is an act of upholding one's own participation in the goods of the community. Over the past 50 years, we have seen the language of rights being used precisely to build up the community by asserting particular rights to particular groups of people. First, the civil rights movement, which moved from asserting moral rights to articulating legal and constitutional ones, so as to break down the predominant American mentality to keep African Americans segregated, that is, outside of the body politic. By recognizing their rights, they became incorporated onto our buses, at our lunch counters, into our schools, and finally into our neighborhoods. Second, in the pro-life movement, we have seen a vigorous attempt to restore to fetuses the rights that Roe v. Wade effectively suppressed. Each gain that the fetus makes of a right not to be terminated or of a right toward living, each time we see a fetus being protected by the state, we see the community's growing recognition of the personal status of the fetus. Finally, in the gay rights movement, we see their search for parity about property, housing, health care, and other issues as steps toward being treated more as persons and being more fully incorporated into the body politic. Thus, as Aristotle taught us, ethics is for the community, and asserting the moral rights of priests is certainly not at the cost of the community, but rather for its benefit. To the extent that these rights are not respected, then, to that extent, not only priest, but the community of the church in its own very communio suffers. Correlatively, to the extent that we withhold these rights, to that extent we exclude priests from being incorporated into the community and relegate to them a second-class status. I am convinced that the process of recognizing, articulating, and asserting the rights of priests is a deeply humanizing process for a group of men who have suffered a great deal these years. I believe that this work of rights helps restore to priests not only their incorporation into the community, but also occasions the possible restoration of much of their humanity that has been disregarded. Thus, we need to see these 6 rights I am proposing as not unrelated to one another. Taking together, these 6 rights more fully comprehend the man in his humanity and in his priesthood. Book 2 of the Code of Canon Law outlines the obligation and rights of the Christian faithful. The first set of rights and obligations belong to the laity, and eventually the Code turns to the rights and obligations of the clergy. Here we find 3 canonical rights: the right of association, the right to a vacation, and the right to fitting and decent remuneration. Instead of these 3 canonical rights, I propose 6 moral ones: the right to share in the episcopal ministry of the local ordinary, the right of association, the right to discern the proper exercise of our ministry, the right to our personal development, the right to privacy, and the right to fair treatment. I'd like to say something about each of them. I'll be more brief on the first 3 inasmuch as I've explicated them before. First, the right to share in the episcopal ministry of the local ordinary. The first right echoes one that had been discussed in the revision of the Code of Canon Law, that is, the right of cooperating with the bishop in the exercise of his ministry. Similarly, this is the right implicitly invoked and exercised by priests in their recent letters to bishops and bishops' conferences. John Lynch claims the right is derived from 3 Vatican II documents. The Decree on the Ministry and Life of Priests writes, "Priestly obedience, inspired through and through by the spirit of cooperation, is based on the sharing of the episcopal ministry, which is conferred by the sacrament of order and of canonical mission." Similarly, the bishop's pastoral office, we find, all priests, whether diocesan or religious, share and exercise with the bishop in the one priesthood of Christ. Finally, Lumen Gentium declares the bishop is to regard his priests, who are his co-workers, as sons and friends, just as Christ called his disciples no longer servants, but friends. The foundation of the moral right is found not only in the Code, its commentary, and in Vatican II documents. It is also found in the right of ordination. The first question the bishop asks the ordinand is, "Are you resolved, with the help of the Holy Spirit, to discharge without fail the office of priesthood in the presbyteral order as conscientious fellow worker with the bishops in caring for the Lord's flock?" Let me conclude then with the prayer of consecration that we hear the bishop say. Lord, grant also to us such fellow workers, for we are weak, and our need is greater. Almighty Father, grant to this servant of yours the dignity of the priesthood. Renew within him the spirit of holiness as a co-worker with the order of bishops. May he be faithful to the ministry that he receives from you, Lord God, and be to others a model of right conduct. The second right, the right of association. The right of sharing in the ministry of the bishop leads to fostering right relations among the clergy through association. Canon 275, paragraph 1 states, "Since clerics all work for the same purpose, namely the building up of the body of Christ, they are to be united among themselves by a bond of brotherhood and prayer, and strive for cooperation among themselves according to the prescripts of particular law." Immediately after this paragraph, the Code adds, "Clerics are to acknowledge and promote the mission of which the laity, each for her or his part, exercises in the church and in the world." Associations, then, among the clergy are intimately tied to promoting the laity's own involvement in the life of the church. In fact, in the earlier draft of the code, the clergy were only called to recognize the laity's mission. According to the promulgated code, they must promote it. Though Canon 215 defined the right of all Christian faithful to form associations, that is, both lay and clergy, Canon 278 establishes it as the first canonical right for priests. The code reads, "Secular clerics have the right to associate with others to pursue purposes in keeping with the clerical state." This is the first time that canon law recognized this moral right. In developing the revised code, the Commission rejected a proposal that placed associations of priests under the local ordinary. To do so would be to infringe on the exercise of the very right that was being promulgated. Now, in the paper, I also quote from natural law, experience, papal encyclicals fostering this right, but let me just conclude on this. The moral right of priests to form association achieves what only solidarity can afford. Throughout the United States, we have seen in the past few years freestanding priest associations emerge. For instance, the Boston Priest Forum, the Milwaukee Archdiocese Priest Alliance, or the New York's Voice of the Ordained. This moral right validates those groups. 3, the right to discern the proper exercise of our ministry. The right to discern the proper exercise of our ministry. While there is an obligation to exercise one's priestly ministry, there is also a right to exercise that ministry according to one's particular judgment. Here I think of pastors who must discern a variety of issues on a weekly basis. Whether this particular couple is actually ready to get married in this church, whether the priest should preach about the way the gospel applies to this particular local issue, or how these children in this parish should be prepared for confirmation. Sometimes this right might engage the rights of the local ordinary to teach. This question was raised last year by the Boston Priest Forum regarding preaching. The Boston Priest Forum wanted to reflect on the conflict that arises when a bishop is engaged in defending one particular value and the local priest believes he needs both to teach what the bishop teaches and to address another possibly competitive value that has been addressed by his local church. There's a mistake here. It's not last year. It's actually 3 years ago, and it was with the predecessor of Archbishop O'Malley. In the USCCB document on Sunday homilies, I just wanted to see if you were following the bouncing ball. That was good, Walter, wasn't it? In the USCCB document on Sunday homilies fulfilled in your hearing, we find the bishops calling the pastor to listen to the scriptures and to the congregation and to respond to that listening. Is there something that happens existentially in that listening that could prompt the pastor to hear the needs of the laity in his parish in some way that the bishop has not yet addressed? If the priest, in all his listening, is also obliged, as Canon 287 states, to foster peace and harmony based on justice, he may find himself needing to obey his conscience as a preacher of the word to the particular congregation he serves. This is not an advocacy for rebel priest. Rather, it recognizes both the context in which a priest exercises his ministry and the process by which he comes to preach the sermon and exercise other forms of ministry. Though by his faculties, a priest exercises his ministry at the bishop's pleasure, there seems to be another claim on the priest that comes not from the bishop directly, but from the people whom the priest serves. If the priest is to truly promote peace and justice and communio, it seems that in order to discern how to do so, he needs to rely on something in addition to the bishop's particular perspective. Like other expressions of his ministry that he shares with the bishop and with the laity, a priest's preaching calls for a conscientious integrity to witness to the gospel as he sees it expressed in his midst. Finally, putting the right of the bishop to teach and the right of the priest to discern the proper exercise of his ministry in tandem with one another is very important to achieve balance. Fourth, the right to our own personal development. In many ways, this right expresses the insight that the priest must learn not only about his parish and chancery, but also about himself. If the previous right is about him developing himself into a professional, this right recognizes that to be a professional, one needs to be a person first. Because of clericalism, most priests' personal affective experiences were measured not with mature adult self-understanding and responsible affective conduct based on mutual respect, but rather on an intuitive sense of what constituted proper discretion. In other words, so long as a priest manifested decorum, he stayed within the boundary lines of acceptable clerical conduct. By this right that I am proposing, however, we see that affective experiences are good and necessary for personal growth and wisdom. This right recognizes what clericalism shadows. It proposes to say that priests need and have a right to the forms of friendship and affective relations that make a person a mature adult, and that he has a right to invoke these experiences as sources of wisdom. The range of the right is broader than simply the development of affective relationships, since it includes intellectual and spiritual development as well. Thus, priests have a right to continuing education, leisure, sabbaticals, retreats, adequate time for daily prayer. In other words, priests have duties in these areas and thereby should have rights as well. A more inclusive right to human development embraces affective experience, that is, intimacy, friendship, while also calling for needed intellectual and spiritual development and their related goods as well. Rightly understood, these spiritual and intellectual developments happen within an affective context. It's like this gathering here. I mean, part of what's happening here is a fellowship. It's not just that we're listening and discussing, but there's some sharing of our priestly identity with the laity, with people who understand our work and who help us. There is a great deal of affect going on, not only when Don hosts drinks, but also when we're in the hallway having breakfast or trying to figure out what to do with the sheets. Rightly understood, then, these spiritual and intellectual developments happen within an affective context. Thus, the right could be expressed, as I heard it from a fellow priest and friend, the right to our own affective experience and the wisdom that derives from it. Let me repeat that. The right to our own affective experience and the wisdom that derives from it. Bernard of Clairvaux supports the claim. He says, Instructio doctos redit, affectio sapientes. Instruction renders us learned. Affection renders us wise. In my own life as a priest, I have received much wisdom about myself, my God, those whom I serve, and my share as a disciple in the mission of Christ as a man, precisely through the affective relations that challenged, sustained, and nurtured me. This right, then, sustains some of the others. For instance, the more a priest has affective relationships, the more he trusts the wisdom he derives from them, the more he should trust his own ministerial competency with his parishioners, and the more he should confidently see his bishop not simply as a father, but as a leader, inviting him into collaborative leadership. This right, in turn, is sustained by the right to associations, wherein priests could nurture the humanity of one another by encouraging them to affectively face and articulate the challenges of priesthood. Fifth, the right to privacy. This right that I just spoke about turns inevitably to the right of privacy. Though this right is found in Gaudium et Spes, this right is found in Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 26. But more recently, The noted moral theologian from Australia teaching in Rome, Brian Johnstone, proposed privacy as the protected zone wherein a person can exercise self-determination, pursuing ends in a shared moral climate wherein the individual and society respect the claims of one another, that is, the individual's personal good and society's common good. This right stands as a vanguard against the suppression of a priest-owned civil liberties, which were dramatically threatened recently by a proposed policy in Milwaukee. The policy had two documents. The first, the Clergy Advocacy and Monitoring Program, specifically dealt with monitoring priests involved in sexual misconduct with minors. The other document, the Clerical Support Initiative, gave the Archbishop ambiguously broad invasive powers on 2 points: that any action by a priest could make him subject to the initiative. The quote is, any act or illness involving a cleric that is deemed inappropriate by the Archbishop. And the second, that the Archbishop solely determines whatever restriction he wishes to impose on the priest. The quote is, the Archbishop retains the right to review, add to, or remove any of the restrictions at any time he deems necessary. The list of potential restrictions for all the listed categories is identical for both documents. Curiously, the document claims that the restrictions are not to be seen as punitive in nature. Quote, this is the quote that they offer, rather they are designed to support the individual in his desire to live according to the example of Jesus Christ, the Gospels, the teaching of the Church, and the demands of his vocation, end quote. Still, as the Archdiocesan spokesman for communications noted, quote, the monitoring protocols, this is for both documents, the monitoring protocols are modeled after those in the criminal justice system for sex offenders on probation or parole. This policy was not a simple action. It required forethought, planning, drafting, recruiting personnel and coordinators, compelling priests, mailing, taking the media questions, etc. Moreover, no one can look at this and not wonder whether other ordinaries have entertained similar procedures. Fortunately, a variety of voices, but most especially the priest of Milwaukee, persuaded the Archbishop to abandon the policy. Though this action occasioned me to think of the need for the right of privacy, quite apart from that incident, the right sustains both a priest's personal welfare and the diocese's own common good. That is, the right to privacy is the right to exercise personal responsibilities and decisions. It is the right to be self-determinative, the right to be a mature adult whose movements are not subject to suspicion or intrusion without civil warrant. The right protects a person to be a person. In short, it allows a priest to have a place he calls his home, a circle of acquaintances he calls his friends, and a conversation to be called confidential. Thus, the assertion of the right to privacy not only shoulders the earlier rights stated above, but it also promotes us now to recognize the relevance of the final right, 6, the right to fair treatment. To appreciate this right, we need to turn to the zero-tolerance policy as it appears in paragraphs 56 to 60 in the Report on the Crisis in the Catholic Church in the United States by the National Review Board for the Protection of Children and Young People. There, the 10 lay authors note that the policy, quote, was deemed necessary because some bishops and religious superiors, in their assessment of sexual abuse by minors by priests under their authority, badly underestimated the seriousness of the misconduct and harm to victim, and allowed wrongdoers to continue in positions of ministry from which they went on to harm others. They conclude, to prevent any recurrences of such situations, the Charter and essential norms remove any further discretion on the part of the bishops and religious superiors in this regard. But what then is the net effect on an offending priest? Here the report notes, quote, accordingly, the zero-tolerance policy applies without regard to any assessment of the degree of culpability. Those are astonishing words. Without regard to any assessment of the degree of culpability of an offending priest based upon such factors as 1, the nature of the sexual act, 2, the frequency of abuse, 3, the efforts to address the problem. The policy also applies with equal force to a priest who reports himself as having engaged in an act of abuse in an effort to obtain help with his problem. Fair treatment usually observes some form of proportionality. And though the review board acknowledges objections from a variety of observers about the fairness and effectiveness of the policy, and though they write, quote, the zero-tolerance policy may seem to be too blunt an instrument for universal application, nonetheless, they believe that for the immediate future, the zero-tolerance policy is essential to the restoration of the trust of the laity in the leadership of the Church, provided that it is appropriately applied. In assessing individual cases in order to determine whether the priest engaged in an act of sexual abuse of a minor, the bishops must consult, they write, with the Diocesan Lay Review Board so that they may strive for individualized justice in light of their developing experience and expertise. The report's caveat, then, with regard to appropriate procedures and diocesan lay review could serve, then, as a witness to the fair treatment of priests. But that witness needs to be guaranteed by the National Review Committee as it endorses the zero-tolerance policy. They have a responsibility to do what they are insisting on. Inasmuch as they recognize disparity regarding the role of these review boards, as well as the application of appropriate procedures, they need to witness to priests' rights while they're also, and rightly, witnessing to the rights of the laity, especially children. Finally, they acknowledge that any discussion of the Charter's zero-tolerance provision would be incomplete without noting that there is no equivalent policy of zero tolerance for bishops or provincials who allowed a predator priest to remain in or return to ministry despite knowledge of the risk. This is still from the document. In fact, in the minds of some priests, the impression was created that the Dallas Charter and the essential norms were the bishop's attempt to deflect criticism from themselves and onto individual priests. They go on. Priests who now stand uneasily under a sort of Damocles with their every action scrutinized, understandably may ask why the bishops do not face such consequences if they fail to abide by the Charter. This distinction has deteriorated the relationship between priest and bishop. I'd like to add that laity asked this question too, and it has deteriorated their relationship with bishops as well. The report concludes its section stating that the bishops must show that they are willing to accept responsibility and consequences for poor leadership. Fairness then cuts two ways. Not only ought due proportionality emerge somehow in the treatment of accused and offending priests, but priests alone cannot and should not bear the weight of the scandal. If a zero-tolerance policy is applied to priests, where is an analogous policy for the scandalous bishops? The scandal will only come to rest when justice has been served, but an inequitable justice is not justice. The National Review Board then had two more responsibilities. They must somehow guarantee that due process and due proportionality are granted to priests, and they must hold proportionally accountable both the offending priest and the offending bishops. No less than Cardinal Avery Dulles has addressed the rights of priests to due process. As we attempt to discern the rights of priests, it is this right, more than any other, that demands that a priest accused deserves to be treated as a human being, that is, as a person. I propose then these 6 rights with the hope that they may further encourage the voice of the clergy. Throughout these recent years, the voice of priests, when it does occasionally, though not at all often enough, and I really mean this, I think that we need to address more often the harm and shame attached to the abuse of children, and that we need also to address the rights of the laity and bishops. But when our voice emerges, it has done so most frequently in the place that we are called to be, the pulpit. I suggest that if priests begin to recognize the rights that are due to them, especially at a time when many find themselves, as the report states, demoralized, they might in turn be more vocal from that pulpit in recognizing the rights of others and in fostering the communio that the church so desperately needs. Healing grace always accompanies restoring